in which I'm going to show you how to build your very own game of Candy Crush. This game is going to be super simple. I say super simple as we're not going to be focusing too much on styling. This is a JavaScript walkthrough. We're very much going to be focusing on the logic of the game. I am doing this so you can take the game, style it up as you want, truly make it your own. This game has a lot of potential, especially with the drag and drop movements we're going to be doing. So I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. In this walkthrough, I'm going to be showing you how to create a board, randomly generate candies all over the board, switch out colors of candies on the board, drag and drop candies, check for matches, check for valid matches, so check that the row of candies doesn't go off into the next row, move all the candies down if you get a match, and generate new candies. By the end of this walkthrough, you should have also got to grips with inbuilt JavaScript functions such as every, sum, for each, include, set attribute, and many more. I would love to see your finished games, so please do share them with me on YouTube or Twitter. My Twitter handle is Anya_Kubo, or Instagram, whatever. Okay, so as always, let's make sure our JavaScript file and style sheet are linked up properly using the script tag and link tag respectively. If you have put the two files in the root of your folder, make sure that reflects in the path you put in your tags. If you're not sure what any of this means, please do watch my video that I've linked as a card here. I am putting my script tag in the header as I want to use a DOM event listener on my JavaScript file. This is a choice that I'm making in my preference as opposed to putting the script tag in the footer. Now we need to go ahead and put a div tag here and give it a class of grid. This div tag is where all the magic happens. So let's give it the respect it deserves and style it up to look like an actual grid. For this, we flip over to our style sheet or CSS file. Now to pick out our div element that we gave a class name to, we get the name, but we also put a dot in front of it. This means class. I have pre-decided that I want my grid to be made up of 8 by 8 squares. I thought 70 pixels squares look nice, so 70 multiplied by 8, that's 560 pixels. Let's give our grid a height of 560 pixels and a width of 560 pixels. As I've done this many times, I know that if we want to put divs inside this grid, the divs will appear stacked over each other. We need to make them snake over each other row by row. So we need to do this by using display flex and then flex wrap so that they break when they can't fit in the grid we have made and start a new row. I'm also going to give the grid a background color just so we can see what's happening in our browser. Let's go ahead. So right click our HTML file to see this in our browser. Okay, cool, a blue grid. If you inspect the page, you will see that information has been passed to our browser. Now, let's tell our CSS file what we want our future squares to look like. As we said, I pre-decided I want it to be 70 by 70 pixels big. So height 70 and width 70. Now, let's create some squares to go in my grid using JavaScript. You will see here I have already put in my DOM event listener as part of my boilerplate setup. I will now be writing all my JavaScript in this event listener for it to be picked up by my script tag, which I placed in the header of my HTML. As mentioned, some people like to put their script tag in the footer of the HTML and skip the DOM event listener. The choice is up to you. This DOM event listener is essentially saying in layman terms that I want all of my HTML file to be read before loading this JavaScript file, and is a more foolproof way of making sure that these events happen in order. Now, using an inbuilt method called a query selector, I am telling my JavaScript file to look at my HTML file and find the element with the class name of grid indicated by this dot, and save it as constant grid. We are doing this so we can reuse this line of code over and over again just by typing grid. Let's also tell our JavaScript file we want our width to be 8 from now on. Let's store that as a constant as it won't change. So the first thing we're going to do is show you how to create a board using JavaScript. I will do this in a function I am choosing to call createBoard. Now, using a for loop, I want to imagine our future grid. We decided it was going to be 8 by 8 squares, so let's use width multiplied by width to tell our JavaScript that. This is the syntax for a for loop. What we are doing here is looping over something 64 times. incrementing by 1 each time from 0. Now, every time it does loop over, we want to create a div. Using an inbuilt method called createElement, we are creating a div element. I'm going to call this square for our HTML file. Next, we need to put that square into our div with a class of grid. We do so using another inbuilt method called appendChild. We do so by passing through the newly created square into our grid constant, like this. Lastly, each time we create a div and add it into our grid, I also want to store it in an array for us to work with. So let's create an empty array first called squares, like this. And now, as well as put a square in the grid, I also want to push that square into my array that I called squares. We do that using an inbuilt method called push. Now that we have done all this, let's see if it works by invoking the function like this. So save the page, go over to our browser, and yep, it has worked. If we inspect the page, we can now see all our divs happily sitting in our grid. Okay, let's flip back now. I'm going to start off by getting an array of all the candy colors I'm going to work with. So I'm going to call this candy colors, as they do not change. I'm going to put them in a constant. So there we go, red, yellow, orange, purple, and green. Now let's go back to our createBoard function. Instead of just creating a square after the square has been created, I also want to give it a candy color. I also want it to be random. To get a random number from our array, we need 3 inbuilt methods. We use mathRandom and multiply it by the arrays like this. Now we want to make sure the number we get back is a full integer. For this, we're going to use mathFloor to round this number down to the nearest full number. And there we go, we now have a random number from 0 to 5. We are starting at 0 as index start count at 0. This is important, so if you're not comfortable with this yet, please make sure a note to research into this later. Once we have a random number, we want to pass that through our candy colors array to get a color and assign it to the square. So let's get the square, and using style background color like this, we want to assign it that random color. Here we are getting our candy colors array and passing through a number to it. So say my random number came out as 1. I'm going to go into my array and get the item with index number 1. In this case, it's yellow, so my square will now be yellow. Okay, let's go into our style sheet to get rid of the blue background we gave our grid to see if this has worked. Remember, what we have written is that now each time we create a square, we are assigning it a random color from our array. Okay, let's save all the files, flip over to our browser, hit refresh, and great, we have our board. Let's refresh again just to make sure the colors are coming up randomly each time. Awesome. Now that we have our board, let's move on. Now, each time I create a square, I also want to make it draggable. This is so we can drag candies into different locations around our grid. Using the inbuilt method setAttribute, I add draggable like this and make it true. Let's save this and see if it has worked. Hit refresh, and great, each square is now draggable. I'm going to do one more thing before we move on, and that is give an ID to each square. This is so that when we move a square or drag one, we know exactly which one in our grid we are moving. This is going to be super useful for later. So again, using setAttribute, we write this and pass through ID as a string and I. As we are looping over with an I, so now each time we loop over this, we're going to give it a number from 0 to 63. Why 63? This is because we have 64 squares in our grid of indexes from 0 to 63. Okay, cool. We are now done with creating the board. The next thing we need to do is concentrate on the draggable feature. Now, to drag the candies, I actually got taught this a while back, and it invokes event listeners that listen out to each stage of dragging. Each stage of the dragging consists of 5 events. This is cool, especially for our styling later, as it allows us to add styling and timers to each of the 5 stages. I'm going to do the bare minimum for us to get the game going and leave you to go wild on the styling later on. So here I'm writing out each of the 5 event listener events. The first one is drag start, as seen in the green string. So for each item, or as I'm going to choose to call square in my squares array, I'm adding an event listener that will listen out for an event. That event is green here and inbuilt. Then if the event is triggered, I want a function to get invoked. The 5 events we have are drag start, drag end, drag over, drag enter, drag leave, and drop. Remember, these are inbuilt. Once we have all the event listeners attached to each square in our grid, we need to write functions for what happens when they are triggered. So let's do that now, all 5 of them. I'm going to put a console log in each one just so I can show you exactly what is happening. Let's also pass through the ID of these squares being listened to. We do so using this ID. This will pick up the element it's being listened to and its ID, which we set using the setAttribute method. Just so we are clear on what is happening, I'm also going to write the event happening in the console log like this. Okay, I'm just going to move drag end and put it towards the bottom of our file, just so I can show you what is happening in order. Once we are happy with this, let's click Save. Now, go to your browser and refresh. Now, when we pick an element to drag, you will see exactly what is happening in our console log. This is super useful. Okay, great. Now back to our JavaScript file. Let's focus on the drag start function, as this is the first event. I want to save the color we have decided to pick up and drag. Let's store this as quite literally color being dragged. Now, in our drag start function, this style background color, I'm going to save this into a variable. I'm doing this because I want to use it again. Let's see if that has worked using the console log. Okay, great. We can now see that we are picking up the color of the square we are dragging. If we click another one, that works too. Now let's focus on the drag end. So in Candy Crush, when you select a candy to put into another location, you actually first swap it out with another candy in that location. So the candies essentially swap place. We can do this in JavaScript. We just need to store another candy color. So let's do that in the drag drop function. If I drop an element in here, I want to store the original color in that square. So let's do that. Let's store this color as color being replaced. So again, using this style, background color. Let's store that up here too. So let color being replaced. Okay, great. We now have the colors stored. To replace them in the correct squares, however, we need to rely on the squares IDs that we set. So I'm going to call this square ID being dragged in our drag start function and assign it this squares ID. We need to make sure this is a number. So using an inbuilt method called parseInt, we are doing just that. So now, as well as the colors, let's store the IDs of the squares being selected and dragged, and the square we are dropping our candy in. Okay, so square ID being dragged and square ID being replaced. Now, in the drag drop is where we assign the ID. We need to make sure this is a number by using the inbuilt method parseInt. So pass the ID through that method and store it again. Okay, now passing through the ID of the square being dragged into the squares array, I want to add this square's color. So just to be clear, this will give the original square being dragged this color after we have dropped in a new color in here. Let's save what we have done so far to check if this is working. So head over to our browser, hit refresh. You will see that if I drag a square and let it goes back. Now, if I drag a square and drop it in another square, it doesn't get dropped. This is not what we expected, right? This is because, like I said, there are 5 stages we need to account for. Let's skip over the drag over and drag enter event for now. I do this using ePreventDefault. So using an E for event, we pass through an event into the function, and using preventDefault, we prevent it from doing its default action. If you do want something to happen while we are dragging the squares over each other, or as it enters a new square, you are free to go back after this walkthrough and add some animations and stylings and whatever. Okay, now let's flip back and refresh. And great, now when we drag a square and drop it into a new one, we change the original square into a color being replaced. We are one step in the right direction. However, the square we are dropping into stays the same color. Let's fix that. So in the drag drop function, we need to make the color of the square change into the color being dragged. Let's do that like this. Okay, great. Now in Candy Crush, we can switch out 2 candies. However, these 2 candies need to be directly in a square above, below, to the left or to the right of our current candy. We need to tell our JavaScript this and define what is a valid move. So, what is a valid move? Let's define this and store it. Let's first get an array of all our valid moves for any square being dragged. I'm going to call it valid moves. So our first valid move is any square being dragged ID -1. So say its ID is 67, we are saying we are allowed to switch out with the square with the ID 66. Now let's do the same with the square visually above our chosen square. So exactly 1 width back in our array. So this time, square with the ID 59 as our width is defined as 8. I'm just going to tie this up a bit, giving them each their own space. Do the same for square 68, so our chosen ID +1. And square 75, so our chosen ID square +8 this time. This is the square that is visually appearing below our square in the grid. Okay, now we have all our valid moves. Let's define a valid move using an inbuilt JavaScript method called includes. I am also going to pass through a value here. So what I'm saying is that if the number I pass through, so the square ID being replaced, is included in our valid moves array, this statement is true, and we store the boolean of true for our valid moves variable. Now, using an if statement, if the ID of my squares being replaced exists, as we want to make sure that this is only going to happen if my square is being dropped in another square and not if it's going off the grid, and, so double and, if this move is valid, we execute the block of code. We need both these variables to be true or truthy in order to execute this code. So, if they are true, we clear the value of square being replaced, ready for a fresh start. If, however, there is a square that the dragged square can be dropped in, but it's not a valid move, indicated by this bang here, so in other words, it's a square that is too far, we execute another block of code. We can't go here, so we want to return the square being replaced to its original spot by simply giving it back its color. We then also need to do the same for the original square. So using the same method, we get the square ID being dragged, pass it through our squares array, and using style background color, assign it the color being dragged. If none of these statements are true, so the square we are dragging has nowhere to go and is outside our grid, we simply add the color being dragged back to its original space. Okay, great. All 3 scenarios are now covered. Let's save and refresh our browser. Great, you will see the squares switching out their colors. You will also see our squares return back if we try and drop it outside of the grid. Everything seems to be working out for us so far. In Candy Crush, if you get a matching row or column of 3, 4, or 5, 3 things happen. The candies disappear, all the candies in the grid move down into a free space, and we gain points. In the actual game, a few more things happen like animation-wise, but as I mentioned, this is a JavaScript walkthrough, so styling, I'm going to leave that up to you at the end. Let's get going on the first part, checking for matches. I am going to concentrate on finding a row of 3 first, as we will use this logic to find matches for the rest. Let's call our function check row for 3. In our function, we are going to first decide how many squares we need to loop over exactly. This is because if you think about it, our row is compiled of 3 squares. If we check for 3 squares starting from index 63 in our grid, this will break the game as there's no squares after square index 63. Using maths, we figure out that the last square we could possibly loop over is 61, so that the loop would check 61, 62, and 63 for a match of 3 colors. Now let's define our row. So if we used indexes to draw our row, it would look like this. An I followed by an I plus 1 and an I plus 2. Each time we loop over this, we are swapping out the I for a number from 0 to 61 now. Each time we loop over, we also want to grab the color the first square is and assign it to the decided color. Let's also define what a blank space is, as we need to account for this when we are looping. So is blank if the square's background color is empty, so db equals empty, this statement is true. Now that we have these 2 things defined, let's get to writing our logic. So using an if statement, let's get the row of 3 array. Using an inbuilt method called every, if every index in our 3 array deeply equals the decided color, so the color of our first square, we want to execute some code. So if we find a match, we want to take the row of 3 array, and for every index in it, we want to give it an empty background color. Great. Now, we also said we want to add a score. Let's make this a score of 3 points each time we find a row of 3. Let's scroll to the top of our JavaScript file and add this as a global variable to our file. We will also set the score as 0 to start. That makes sense, right? Great. Now let's scroll back down and invoke this function we wrote to see if it works. Let's go ahead and save this, refresh the browser, and amazing. We can see here that 1 row has been deleted. Now, we want to actually invoke this function constantly while we are playing the game. At the moment, this only gets invoked once we start up the browser, meaning that if we get any matches from now on, they will not be cleared. We can do this using a set interval and grabbing our window. So with this here, I'm getting our window, adding the inbuilt method of set interval to it, and saying that any code in this function, so in my case, the check row for 3 function, I want to invoke every 100 milliseconds. Let's save this and check it in our browser. Now, it's important to note that this will keep running indefinitely until you close your tab. I am going to keep it like this, but if you want to take your game to the next level and also, for best practice, I would suggest adding a button to activate this set interval and also maybe add some pause and start functionality. I do this in some of my other games, so if you want to see how to do that, please do check out my Tetris game, for example. Okay, now that that works, let's carry on. Okay, now that we have that, I'm literally going to copy paste this to make our check column for 3 function. With a few changes, of course. So let's start by changing the name of the function, change the pseudocode for good measure, change the name of the array here, here, and here, change when the loop stops. So as these are columns, the last square we can check for a column of 3 is square 47. Change the array itself to be a column using width and width multiplied by 2. and change the name of the function here when we invoke it. We also now add it to our set interval. Okay, that should do it. Let's head over to our browser. Okay, fantastic. It looks like our game is working as we wanted to. We can see here that the columns and rows are deleting if they find a match. Now, I'm trying to find an example here, even though it's hard to come by. But what do you think happens when a row starts at the left or right-hand edge, or half of its body is in the right-hand column or edge? It will appear to be broken up in two, but still valid, as we haven't told our JavaScript that this is not a valid move. We need to fix this. As this can only happen for rows, let's go back into our check row for 3 function. Back in our function, let's define what is a valid move. Again, let's get an array of all the indexes that are not valid. What I am typing here is every index I do not want my row of 3 to start at. So I don't want to start at index 6, otherwise the row will appear on the other side of my grid. Same for index 7, and so on and so on. All of these are not valid for me to start my checking for 3 at. So once again, let's get the array and use the includes inbuilt JavaScript method. In it, we pass through I, so the number we are looping. If this number is included in the array not valid, we want to skip it. We do so like this, using continue. And that's it. Let's check this in our browser. Let's save and hit refresh. It's hard to tell, but we have now fixed our problem of rows of 3 splitting up and still counting as valid rows. Remember, we do not need to do this for columns, as we already have stopped our columns from going through the bottom by stopping the loop at square 47. The only thing we need to do now are copy exactly what we have done for rows and columns of 3, but do the same but checking for 4 this time. In my code, I'm literally going to copy and paste the check row for 3 and check for column of 4 function. I mean, you probably shouldn't really do this. You should type each one out, as copy and pasting can be really dangerous, especially when, adjusting copy paste to something really similar. But hey, I feel comfortable with it, so I'm just going to go for it. Okay, so this is my pasted code. I appreciate it's hard to tell. Once again, I'm going to change the 3 here to a 4, the pseudocode. Rename the function, change the array name, change the loop to stop at 60, and add an item to the array to make it a row of 4. I'm also going to update the not valid indexes to include indexes starting at 5 and so on, as now each row needs to be checked 1 square earlier for each row. Change the array name here, change the score to add 4, change the array name here, and change the function name to check for a row of 4. And finally, change the column of 3 copy version to column of 4 in the pseudocode. Check the function name, change that, make the array an actual column of 4, change the name of the array here, change the score to add 4, change the name here, rename the function to say check for column of 4. Now we add these 2 new functions into the set interval. I want to check for 4 before checking for 3, as we want to get rid of the big ones first. Okay, let's save that. Refresh the page. I'm getting an error message. I told you copy and pasting was dangerous. What's it saying? It seems that my array name has not been defined in our check column for 4. Let's go fix that now. Ah yes, I forgot to change the array name. We were still using the old one here. Okay, that's now fixed. Let's go ahead and save. And there we have it. I am actually going to leave this here. If you want to go ahead and add a check for 5, please do. I feel we do not need to go over this because it's simply a case of copy and pasting. Hopefully you get the idea now of what we need to do and what needs to be changed in order to check for 5. Let's now instead focus on how to get the candies to move down if some have been cleared, and also how to get new candies to generate. We need to write a function that will move all our candies down if a certain condition is met. So let's do that before checking any of our matches here. In our code, let's start by writing out what we want to happen. Now, I'm going to choose to call my function move candies. Actually, let's call it move down. I'm going to use a for loop here again to check all our squares up to square 55. So essentially the first 7 rows. I'm going to do this as I want to check the squares below each of the indexes for an empty square. So in this if statement, I am getting the index number plus the width and passing it through our squares array. Once I am in that square, I want to check that square's background color. If that square has an empty background color, I want this statement to be true. So what we are saying here, if the square directly below our square we are looping has an empty background color, we want to execute the following code. We want to essentially give our square's background color to it. So again, we are simply using the star background color to do this and passing a color to the empty square. Now we want to remove any color from our square, making it appear empty. The final thing we need to do is put it in our set interval. So let's copy this, scroll down into our set interval, and place it there. I'm going to put it before the others just so it executes first. Okay, now let's save and refresh our browser. And great. We can see that the squares are all clearing as we get matches. Now we need to do one last thing, and that's generate new candies to show up in our first row. Now let's think about the logic here. I think it's safe to say that if the first row contains an empty square, we want to fill it with a colored one. And we keep doing this until the first row is not empty anymore. So let's do it. Let's define the first row first. I'm simply going to write an array putting an index of 0 to 7. Now to check if something is in the first row, we do this. Get the first row, attach includes to it, and pass through I. Now, if I is in the first row array, the statement will come back as the boolean of true. So, if is first row comes back as true, and the square has a background color of empty, and this is true, we need to do something. We need to fill it with a color. Using this line we wrote before, we get a random color. This should be familiar to you. It is literally the exact same line we wrote before. I know I call it a random color, but it's technically a random number from our candy colors array, so a number from 0 to 5. Once we get a random number from our candy colors array, we need to pass it through our array to get a string of a color name. We then assign it to our square in the first row. Cool, let's look at this in action. Let's refresh, and amazing, that has now worked. Now, let's get the score to display, as we are collecting a score, but not really doing much with it at the moment. For this, let's decide we are going to make a div with an ID of score and call it a score display. We will need to add this to our HTML file, but for now, let's just add it in our JavaScript first. So let's scroll down to every time we add a score. Using the constant, I'm going to use an inbuilt method in HTML. We then assign the score to it. I'm now going to add this to all 4 of our checking for matches functions after every time we add to our scores variable. Once we have done that, let's flip over to our HTML. In our HTML file, I'm actually going to add a div with the class of scoreboard first. This is so that we can style a board where we want our score to show up. Inside, I am placing 2 h3 tags, one with the word score and one with the ID of score. This is what we assign the const of score display to in our JavaScript. Now let's save and head over to our browser. Okay, great. We now have a fully functioning game of Candy Crush. As mentioned, this is a super simple version of the game. I have not added in checks for matches of 5. Please feel free to do that if you want. Also, in the official Candy Crush game, we have a lot more funky stuff going on. I hope that by getting to where we have so far, you are now comfortable and have the tools to go ahead and add all of these funky features to your game. Hopefully you can also create your own, and hey, the world's your oyster. I am going to show you one more thing, and that's how to add images to each candy color. So if you want to listen to this, please do carry on. Let's go ahead and do that now. So let's flip back to our code. In this list of candy colors here, I'm going to want to replace them with images. Now I'm going to create a folder here to drop some images I have pre-made. If you want these images, I'm going to share them all with you. I'm going to put a link to my GitHub in the description, or you can feel free to also make your own. I have made each image 70 by 70 pixels so that it will fit in each of my squares perfectly. Once I have made this folder, I'm simply going to drag all my made images into this folder. So here are my images. I am simply selecting them and dragging them into my project folder. If I click on this images folder now, you will see all my image files. Now I'm going to copy each relative path of each image like this. Note, I'm using the word URL and placing each path in brackets like this. You need to get the exact path name for this to work. Now, because we are not using the background color anymore, we are using background image, we need to find all the instances of when I say background color in my file and replace them. Atom has a cool find and replace function that helps me replace each one without missing any. You can see here I have used the word 30 times. I'm going to go ahead and click replace all. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and see if that has worked. And amazing, there are all my candies. I obviously still have a whole bunch of console logs in my code. One thing I would suggest is definitely clearing this up before you publish your code anywhere, just for good practice. Now, I'm just going to show you something that I baked a little earlier. This is my styled version of my Candy Crush-like game. We mentioned earlier in the walkthrough that a button starting and stopping this game would be wise, as we are essentially invoking the functions every 100 milliseconds. So adding a button would be best practice if you want to take this game to that extra level. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. As always, I would love to see your finished games. Please do tag me on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. I'd love to see what you've built, how you're taking the game, made it your own, taking it to that next extra level. So yeah, enjoy, and thanks again.